2,000 years ago, the courageous ancestors of these native Hawaiian children sailed north from the islands of Polynesia and discovered the beautiful land that today we call Hawaii. In the centuries that followed this discovery, the native Hawaiian people developed a thriving culture that was built around a reverence and attachment to the land.
In the Hawaiian concept of land is sacred, and land is a sacred ancestor and ancestress. And the land is not owned, but the people provide stewardship over the land.
Land was held communally. Really, it was viewed that the ali'i, or the ali'i moku, the highest chief, held the land in trust for the gods and for the benefit of the people. The Western system was very much oriented towards specific people owning specific parcels of land.
Land is a commodity to be bought and sold and possessed.
When that Western concept came into conflict with the Hawaiian ownership system, there was a great turmoil.
With great turmoil in Hawaii came immense pressure for the sale of lands to Westerners, and there was increased pressure to change the land tenure system.
This was a transcendent process trying to move lands from a traditional perspective of sharing to one more like the Western concept of land ownership. It's still an incomplete process, and that's the important thing to remember. It was clear when you look back at all the documents in 1846 starting this process that the common people, the maka'ainana, were to get 1/3 of the lands. But the implementation of that failed. And so since then, we've been trying to move some of that land back into the hands of the common Hawaiian people. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was a small step in that direction, but this effort is still very much unfinished.
Well, it really broke the sacred bond that Native Hawaiians had to the land, because now land became a commodity, something that could be bought and sold, rather than a sacred ancestor and ancestress. And it also physically separated most of the Hawaiians from the land, because as the lands that the chiefs got began to be sold to foreigners, and as part of the lands that the government got also were auctioned off and mostly went to foreigners, then the foreigners holding those lands began to evict Hawaiians from those lands. And as the Hawaiians themselves, who were protesting in 1845 in petitions to the king and the council, predicted, they said, you know, if you do this land ownership, then the Hawaiian people are going to end up as homeless people in our homeland.
We now turn to a video clip of Daviana from 1999, briefly highlighting a turning point in Hawaii's history.
In 1848, King Kamehameha III had set aside a total of 2.4 million acres for the Crown and the government. By the time that these lands were ceded by the Republic of Hawaii, it amounted to 1.8 million acres.
And these lands are the lands that we know today as the ceded lands. At the time of the overthrow in 1893, the provisional government said the government lands now belong to the provisional government and whatever entity is created.
Queen Liliuokalani protested the annexation. She never surrendered her claim to the ceded lands. Neither she nor her people were compensated for them.
2 years after the 1898 annexation, of Hawaii by the United States, Hawaii became a U.S. territory with the signing of the Organic Act.
During the kingdom period, the king had possession and managed the crown lands, which were about 1 million acres of land. And then there was another collection that started off at about 1 million acres, but came down to about 800,000. That was called the government lands. And the government lands were to be a resource for the government to draw upon. The crown lands supported the monarchy, which of course was exclusively a Hawaiian entity. Westerners had their eyes on these lands. Sanford Dole, when he was a young man, wrote that the crown lands should be transferred and sold. After the overthrow, when the Republic came in, the Republic mushed these two lands together. and just called them public lands. So the integrity of the Crown lands was lost during that period. And after annexation, the United States did the same thing when Hawaii was a territory. They simply treated these lands as public lands, but they didn't merge them with the entire public lands of the United States. They did appreciate that these were special lands to be held in trust. And as early as 1899, the U.S. Attorney General wrote that these lands were to be held in trust. The ceded lands are the Crown and government lands together. Okay. So the Republic of Hawaii, 1894, combined these in their constitution and tried to sort of sell some of them off, but by good fortune, the Crown lands were in long-term leases to the sugar plantation. So despite the efforts of the Westerners, they were unsuccessful in disseminating these lands. So they maintained their integrity and are still, for the most part, public lands. The government lands, some of those were transferred, but at the time of annexation, we still had 1.8 million acres that were the ceded lands, and these were 1 million Crown lands, 800,000 government lands.
I call these lands the Hawaiian National lands because these were the lands of the Crown lands, the King of Hawaii, and then also the lands that belong to the government of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So together, these are the Hawaiian National lands. Now, the provisional government then claimed these ownership over these lands, and so did the Republic, which succeeded it, did the same. And then at the time of annexation, the Republic turned over its claim to the federal government, the U.S. federal government, as part of annexation. And as John just said, the federal government did not put it into its inventory of lands. It continued to hold it as a public trust so that it had oversight over it and so-called ownership, which is still questionable. And then, but they also had the territory actually manage the lands day to day. In 1921, Prince Kuhio, as delegate to Congress, went to Congress and said the Crown lands, which were the lands of the king, and which should have rightfully been dispersed, to give a 1/3 to the people, should be set aside for Native Hawaiians to homestead because Hawaiians continued to decline in numbers, and he was afraid Hawaiians would become an extinct people. And he asked for these lands to be set aside, and Congress acknowledged a special trust relationship at that time to Native Hawaiians as indigenous people to Hawaii, and they set aside 200,000 acres of not only Crown land but government land for Native Hawaiians to homestead. And then the rest of the lands were, some of them were used for, became national parks and some military lands, and then the rest with the territory used as its, territorial lands for different public works projects and education.
So that's very, very interesting because here we are looking for federal recognition, but it seems as if we had a limited amount of federal recognition at the time of the Hawaiian Home's creation.
Right, that's correct. Since 1921, the policy of Congress has been to recognize Hawaiians as indigenous people. That is the existing policy. What has to happen is for the Supreme Court to recognize that that's the policy. And because of the challenges, for Congress to reaffirm what is its existing policy.